Good day, and welcome to the Secure Connections podcast brought to you by IOTSA, the Internet of Things Security Services Association. I'm Brian Sherman, Content Director for IOTSA, and I feel honored to be hosting today's episode as we discuss how machine learning impacts the various stages of threat detection and response. Joining me in this conversation, thankfully, because I can't carry this load by myself, is our special guest, Greg Rosenberg, Senior Manager of Sales Engineering for Managed Threat Response at Sophos. Welcome to the Secure Connections podcast, Greg.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Really happy to be here.
Good, and I'm glad you're here. It sounds like an exciting topic, and I'm looking forward to learning a little more about the machine learning aspects of threat detection, and it's a lively conversation and one that I don't think we've had. I think we've touched a little bit on it with maybe Steve on a previous call, but you're also a first-time guest. So let me start out by asking you to tell us about yourself and your role at Sophos.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I run a sales engineering team here at Sophos, and my team is really responsible for two activities. The first is surrounding managed threat response. So we help educate people with technical tools about why threat hunting is needed and important. And then on the flip side, we also handle intake for our incident response service, what we lovingly refer to as rapid response. So my team is on the tip of the spear when it comes to customers experiencing ransomware or other malware outbreaks and need help immediately as well. So I've got a team around the globe that helps customers in all regards.
Very cool. So before we get into, I don't want to deep dive into the machine learning part, the AI part, but can you share what the various stages of threat detection and response are?
Sure. And I think this is one of these questions that if you ask a lot of vendors or professionals, they'll have a lot of different definitions. I try to be industry agnostic when I think about this. But broadly speaking, what we're trying to determine is, can we find threats that tools are unable to find on their own? And the basic premise is that whether it be an endpoint protection product or a firewall or other security infrastructure, the challenge is that our adversaries are always evolving their techniques. And so we have to be able to ask broad questions in a variety of ways to identify malicious activities. So threat detection and response is, in summary, just a way to identify suspicious activities that tools probably can't identify on their own. They require human interaction.
Okay. So it's kind of like if you look at the bell curve of threats, is the majority are going to be in the middle that the tools will pick up and find, but you're probably looking at that far end of the anomalies that you have to look for. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And I think the bell might be shifting left or right or flattening out in some way. Broadly speaking, from an adversary perspective, they're conducting their own return on investment calculation when they're figuring out whom and when to attack and how much effort they're going to expend. But we always work under the premise that you at least need good infrastructure underneath the hood. You have to have good endpoint protection. You have to have good firewalls. You have to have good hygiene. But once you get past those hurdles, and hopefully we maintain those products really well, and that's a big if, once you get past that, there are still mechanisms that an adversary can leverage that those tools just can't pick up on their own. Because, a good example might be adversaries like to use applications that are pre-installed. So what we refer to as living off of the land, something like PowerShell, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with and use on a regular basis. It's great for automating things. It's great for an adversary to deploy their footholds throughout your organization as well if it's not properly configured. So as we start looking at that back half of the bell there, we start to see a lot of activity that is designed to evade a lot of those technologies that are already installed in a lot of customers' environments.
Right. Now, I know within the MSP community, you see a lot of providers that spend a lot of time getting their foundational down. The tools you mentioned before is to get those known threats out of the way. But what are your recommendations for those providers now that the threats are changing? I mean, rapidly. You talked about the tools. They have technology that they're utilizing to automate, the threats, ransomware, all of these other things. Is what things should MSPs be focusing on within their own tool set right now?
The first thing that I always tell MSPs is start with your own hygiene first. In other words, one of the big challenges that we encounter in the incident response space is that MSPs or their customers a lot of times will come to us with really good tools, but they're not properly implemented or maintained. So I always tell organizations, put in some sort of cadence where you're going to review the configuration, right? So we don't want to see things like a whole lot of the protections disabled. We don't want to see a whole lot of exclusions for a lot of those native tools. They should be written as specifically as possible, and get a varying set of eyes on them when you run through and perform an audit of it. Just like with your firewall rule sets, these things tend to grow over time. And a lot of times people don't have a good idea as to why someone allowed remote desktop protocol 5 years ago. And if you can't provide that explanation, good way to test out whether or not that rule should be in place or whether or not a protection is turned off is flip the switch. If you can in a test environment and see what the response is. And if you don't get a phone call, well, then you've got an answer to your question, assuming they don't have documentation. That's a big if. But that's the first thing, is take care of what you've got first. Beyond that, I tell people that they have to be able to have visibility. This is one of the big challenges I think that a lot of MSPs are facing is, if I come with a good tool set that does good blocking on the front end, what are the specific use cases that I should have visibility into? And I always respond by saying, all right, well, can you actually monitor activity from everything, right? So not just firewalls and intrusion detection systems and access points, but all of the endpoints and servers. So number one, you need a way to ingest data from those sources. But number two, you have to ingest the right data as well, right? So you can't just come with a product like endpoint detection and response. It's just a tool. But if you don't configure it to actually seek out interesting information, then it's not going to do you any good. And then number three, and this is what I think dovetails nicely into the machine learning conversation, is if you're doing it properly, you're probably going to get a whole lot of alerts. And so a lot of people miss is when they're evaluating solutions, someone should be able to answer how those alerts are prioritized and which ones are dismissed. What do I look at first? And how do I evaluate the solution? So those are the ways that I think about this: is start with the good tool sets, make sure you've got good hygiene, then make sure that you've got good visibility or tools to collect information from everything, and then work on process to evaluate what those alerts are.
Very good. And Greg, with MSPs, obviously are kind of not just the tip of the spear, but they're being targeted a lot these days too by cyber criminals. Is there any additional things that they need to look at in their own ecosystem environment?
Yeah, that MSPs are a juicy target from adversaries because it comes back to that ROI calculation. It's just an efficient mechanism to spread widely very quickly, where it's pretty easy to do a search to identify MSPs that are out there. And it's probably not terribly difficult to understand how many customers they serve as a result. So the first thing that I always focus on, again, relating back to that hygiene, is if you're going to leverage like an RMM or a PSA tool, please have multi-factor authentication turned on everywhere, because we actually do see attacks that, essentially leverage the tooling that they're working with on a daily basis to enter into the customer environment and deploy malware or other footholds. The second point that I would address with a lot of MSPs is don't rely on the exclusions that the provider gives to you as being global. In other words, if they say to you, well, you need to allow PS kill globally to shut down a process. Okay, well, how and when is it used? Are there ways that I can write these exclusions more specifically? So whenever we talk about providing exceptions or exclusions, let's ask the vendors of the tools why we're doing it as well. And then the third thing that I just want a lot of MSPs to be cognizant of is in case something bad happens, have an incident response plan. I'm not saying a technical plan even. I'm just saying if you're speaking to an analyst that's, going to pick up the phone at 3 a.m. on a Sunday, they should instantly be able to flag an alert when it's really bad and be able to reach someone to say, I've got a bad incident. We need to get someone in here quickly. Time is really critical. And they know, the adversaries, that off hours are the time that they prefer to hit you with the final, ransomware payload. So you're only as strong as your weakest link in this regard. So you need to have an incident response plan that you have available that is consumable by everyone, that they're not scared to use, and that you test.
Yeah. And I would assume update frequently too, since people change and processes change all the time.
Absolutely. So there should be some sort of review function. A lot of organizations we see at least take a look at it annually. It very well might not need updating as a result, but there needs to at least be a call tree or an email tree so that the right people are notified. And when we talk about MSPs, there very likely could be a customer notification process, which, considering how many customers could be served, could be extensive. There are other considerations that an incident response plan should include, things like, do we have to have outside legal counsel because of compliance requirements? Do I or my customers carry cyber liability insurance, and what are the implications for that as well? In other words, they might start saying, oh, we only want our general counsel in here to shield us for privilege requirements. And then it becomes really interesting because then you've got 3 or 4 different entities all swooping down on you. And you don't want to just be figuring that out for the very first time without a plan. So have a plan.
That makes sense. Boy, I think back like 10 years ago is nowhere near as complicated as it is today. But it's not being envious of MSPs, but boy, you really have to focus on the process and evaluation all the time on what you're doing. And obviously there's great rewards with that, but there's not much leeway anymore.
And the saving grace, at least, of having a plan is it's not that it's terribly complicated to build this thing out. You don't need an advisor to do it. You just need to cycle through at least some basic contact procedures as well. And it really actually saves you a lot of time, because once you get to having to deal with an incident, it's not so much the cost of paying for a ransom that becomes the biggest challenge. It's the loss of operations that is the most front of mind question that we get asked. Like, when will we be back up to normal, or when will my customer's environment be restored? It's not, oh my gosh, I'm worried necessarily about the publicity or the damage to systems. It's, we need to get back up and running, because I can't even pay you to fix this if we're not up and running.
I'm just thinking of an incident I had the other day talking to an MSP, and the VoIP system was out for a client on the weekend. It was a restaurant. And
yeah,
that's one system that went down, and it was full chaos. So I can imagine a ransomware attack, what an MSP has to go through too to make sure. I know the processes and things, but I'm thinking that the mental part of it, the emotional part of it, and the reputational concern as well for when these things happen. So it's a lot more comprehensive than it used to be, and how much thought goes into these things.
It is.
So let's switch off to today's topic. Again, not that we've been avoiding it, but I think that's a good background for where we wanted to go today. How does one distinguish between machine learning and AI? Because that's always one of the top questions I get too.
Yeah, and it's one that I field a lot. And if back when we could travel, when you went to any conference floor, you'll see artificial intelligence and machine learning, splattered everywhere across the show floor. Um, I think most people who have a decent enough understanding would say that artificial intelligence doesn't really exist yet, even though it's used commonly as a term.
Mhm.
Um, the loose definition of it is more along the lines of a system that can independently act and mimic human thought, right? So probably most people conceptualize that as like a robot that can independently act, and maybe their minds divert to Terminator, and we get a lot of those types of comments or questions or
You got me at
concerns.
that. I was thinking Terminator right away.
Skynet is coming, right? It's the most common way that we think about it, but there's actually some truth in it, right? That it doesn't require some form of human interaction. Machine learning is, technically a subset underneath artificial intelligence. And there's different versions of machine learning and definitions, but the way that I broadly think about it, the consumable definition, is that it is a tool that helps us, at least in the security space, make accurate predictions. And so if you kind of contrast machine learning against where the security space was 5 or 10 years ago, we used to rely on static tools and signature files, right? A good reference point is antivirus software. The way it used to work is, as antivirus vendors identified malware, they go, I've got a sample of this malware. I'm now going to write a signature so it actually matches part of the code. If I happen to see that software enter onto the system when I run a scan, or if it tries to execute, I go, aha, these first 8 bits match. There's technically more complexity there, and it knocks it down. It quarantines or deletes the file. Well, that doesn't really work anymore, because most malware that is out there is what we refer to as polymorphic, right? So it actually changes on the fly. Most customers that see it, it's unique just to them. So you can't do an exact match of code. And so the way machine learning is used in this space is it says, aha, show me this thing, this file, this potential piece of malware, and ask the question, how similar does it look to everything else that I've seen before, other versions of malware and other versions of good software, or benignware, as we like to say. So machine learning is just a tool, broadly speaking, in the security space that is designed to help us make predictions. It technically is designed to learn on its own if you feed it a set of data, and then there's subsets of machine learning. But it definitely requires human care and feeding. In other words, you have to give it good data first in most cases. And then if you want to use what's called supervised machine learning, you have to label the data. In other words, you say, this is bad or this is good. And then from there, you have to be able to tweak the algorithms underneath machine learning to determine where that line is drawn between bad and good. So that's how I distinguish it.
No, I think that's great. And that's a tremendous amount of data, I would assume, too, that this is filtering through.
It is. That's actually one of the distinguishing factors, because you can build a really crummy machine learning model. You can build a model, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be accurate or viable. And most machine learning models are built off of training data, where you actually tell it, hey, here's the good stuff. And just as a matter of scale, we have a lot of machine learning models here at Sophos, as do other vendors. We literally, just for malware, look at hundreds of millions of samples of files. And that's really kind of, the baseline that you need to build a good model for some of these complex threats that are out there. There's technically multiple models based off of what it is that you're trying to block or prevent. But the training data is really important. So when you're an MSP and you're trying to evaluate a security solution, I always tell people, ask them the question how they build their models if they're using it. And the litmus test is not so much, well, we've got this sample from this source and this other sample from this source. Normally, my litmus test is when there's a lot of hand waving going on and stuff sounds funny, It probably is. It means that they don't actually understand how the model is being built. And that's normally an indication that you should probably look elsewhere.
Okay. So in probably to be overly simplistic when it comes to AI and machine learning, are these are tools to help cybersecurity experts predict and figure out threats along that line, and to be able to respond quicker is really what it's about, right? Is how to mount the proper response and how quickly to do it.
That's right. When we think about these models, number one, we have to ask the right questions at the front end. In other words, there's not a one-for-one rip and replace. I take legacy security technology here.
Mhm.
Okay, I'll just replace it with a machine learning model. It doesn't quite work like that. We very well might have bad data, or there might be a better way to accomplish the same task of killing the threat at the same point in time. So I'll give you an example. There are a lot of different security tools that monitor websites that organizations, employees visit. And I think we all probably know that you can kind of classify websites, broadly speaking, where maybe you don't want your employees going to adult sites, gambling sites. Maybe you will allow certain individual sites. It's a challenge to enforce the website classification. Number one, new sites kind of come up all the time. And so that used to be a task that was performed manually. Literally, there are people who would just categorize sites as they came online or as they learned about them, where there wasn't a classification system as well. There's an interesting approach that the data science team has taken here, where you can actually look at the URL within a site and ingest a lot of these URLs, like on the order of billions of them, and make a prediction about how viable that site is, or what category it will fall into, or whether or not it's serving up malware, just based off of the URL and some other factors. So we're not actually having someone scan the sites. We're just saying, hey, how similar is this URL to other bad ones that we've seen before? And it's not that it will necessarily categorize everything or black everything out, but it will be very efficient and allow you to then do some other scanning in a much more limited capacity to conserve resources. So these models can be used to not only identify threats, but at least preserve capacity for other tools to help block the threats in a different way.
Yeah. So you don't just use like one model. Sophos doesn't have one model. You're using multiple models.
That's right.
For this process.
Yeah, it's ML everywhere is probably the best way I think about it. You can probably estimate that the bulk of what most vendors are doing today, at some point in probably the next 5 to 10 years, will be largely covered by machine learning models. Part of the driver for that is, frankly, the adversaries themselves. It is becoming relatively painless to subvert a lot of these static tools or rules-based systems that are out there. And frankly, they have really good test beds where they have a hold of a lot of the vendors' products that are out there, and they actually are developing their own models. You've got data science teams wearing the red hats now, not the blue hats, where they are essentially constructing models to make predictions as to what they think will get past a lot of those vendors' products. And in fact, they'll test them in real time to ensure that they're efficacious.
Yeah. That's a hard thing, because it only takes one hit by a bad actor to.
That's right.
Destruction.
That's right. Once they get that initial foothold, and that's really key. Once either there's been misconfiguration, which is why we talked about hygiene, making sure the tools that you've got are configured properly. Once they've got that initial foothold, whether it be a vulnerability that's been exploited or a remote service that was left wide open by accident, then their job becomes a lot easier, because if they have an account with appropriate privilege, if they especially get a hold of an admin account, well, most security tools are not looking for malicious behavior by an admin account who's permitted to do a lot of these elevated activities. That's really when it becomes a a challenge at that point. You can still monitor for that activity, but at that point, then it's just a question of time, how much they can move throughout the environment laterally, how much they can establish communication remotely to their command and control servers, how much they can then push out scripts that are using legitimate tools. That's the one thing that, I just worry about, is that initial access that, people just say, well, I've got great tools. Well, if you've got great tools, but you're not monitoring to make sure they're in a good health state, it's all for naught.
It's a scary world out there, especially when you look at some of the large vendors that have tremendous amount of protections in place, and all the cyber criminals have to do is keep hammering them. And the nation states in particular, is they want to get in, they'll keep working until they can find a way in.
They are persistent.
Yeah. So can you provide a recent example of an attack where machine learning detected a threat? Maybe make it a little more real.
Yeah, so we get the benefit of seeing a lot of the attacks as they evolve, especially on the incident response side of the house. One of the ones involves this group called Conti. They're a ransomware group. We name ransomware based off of the group and the actual payload, or the executable file that encrypts things on user systems. So I just want to get that out there on the front end. Conti was interesting for a couple of reasons. There's always some sort of initial vector where they get that foothold. But what made Conti unique was the fact that even if it couldn't reach out to their command and control infrastructure, right? So when someone gets a foothold, a lot of people, think, oh my gosh, most ransomware is me just visiting a website that has been compromised, or clicking on a link in an email to go to that website, or downloading a file. That's it. The ransomware happens immediately. Nope. Let's rewind a little bit. These are really staged attacks where the dwell time could be days, weeks, or months. However long it takes the attacker to essentially compromise a lot of the accounts, find all the critical systems, the things that hold value, they're normally in there for at least a couple of weeks in most of these cases. But what's really critical for most of these attacks is that they establish command and control infrastructure. In other words, they have a listener in your environment, the victim's environment, and it reaches out to command and control infrastructure, probably somewhere halfway across the world, probably another compromised system. And this gives them what we refer to as hands-on keyboard. So once that foothold has been established, this allows them to, map out the environment, do what we call enumeration or reconnaissance. How many systems do you have? What are the endpoints? What are the servers? What operating systems are they running? And then they'll use that information to identify vulnerabilities that they can exploit, and then establish persistence, so that even if, some of the victim organization restarts systems, that they'll pop back up after the reboot. So what was unique in this particular situation was, even if their command and control infrastructure was cut off, they had the ability to still automate some of the activities to move around the environment and eventually encrypt systems. And once you've hit the encryption phase, that's the end of the line. They feel like they've got enough data where they can extract a ransom from you, or threaten to leak data out. So that was the novel piece of this, is that there are a lot of activities that normally would be considered legitimate, that really, had we not identified this activity first and then built it into some of our models, we wouldn't be able to identify, because it was novel in this way.
Yeah, it's when you look at the threats that are out there, it's scary, but it's great to see that some of this, you've got solutions now that can address the risks and take them out. How do you evaluate solutions with some of these complex campaigns or programs that are out there now, Greg?
Yeah, so that's a really hard one, especially, I try to put myself in the mind of an MSP, looking at this in terms of a system. And that's the first thing that I think of is, if I put together all of these disparate tools from disparate vendors, what sort of coverage do I have? The first recommendation I have is that the MITRE attack framework, for those of you who aren't familiar, MITRE's has this as an open source project, essentially. There's a lot of contributors. Essentially what they do is they map overall tactics and then individual techniques that the adversaries use to accomplish those. I tell people, take all of your solutions. Hopefully the vendors have some sort of mapping against attack, and just see where you have coverage. You won't necessarily get complete coverage. No one's getting to 100%. I just want to set that baseline here. It's aspirational at this point. And I also caution people, don't take what the vendor says to you as absolute fact. If you can test some of these techniques in certain scenarios, then by all means, go ahead and do so. There are some third-party tests for these techniques that obviously probably hold more trustworthiness, but consider all of these tools in aggregate as a system and then map it against the attack framework. And hopefully you actually have more than one tool to cover the same technique more than once. Again, because people goof stuff up, right? People, turn off protections or add exclusions. And I get it that you need that in order to operate as a business. But hopefully you have broad coverage and duplication of coverage in certain areas where it makes sense.
Yeah. I think the layered approach has really taken on in the channel, especially over the last couple of years, especially in the work from home environment right now too. But it becomes a challenge for MSPs to find the right mix between what their clients need and end user friendliness, I should say, and making it so they can be productive.
And I don't think there's a problem representing the coverage that they're sharing, the coverage that they offer, and what the customer eventually is purchasing. I think everyone's always making some form of trade-off, the cost for security. And so other organizations, if they don't want to have complete coverage, that's probably okay in certain circumstances. I just think that we as an industry need to be more transparent about what it is that we're doing and how we're accomplishing or protecting or providing visibility as a result of this. And, to that end, I think we also just have to be transparent that there's limitations to any one tool that's out there. We need to do a better job as an industry of explaining what it is that our tools do in a way that people can consume right now.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because I think that's the hard part too, is bridging that gap between too much information, too much technology, and not enough awareness. And
that's right.
Yeah, that's a struggle. I think everybody, I'm not envious of the MSPs having to figure that out every day. But no, awesome. Yeah, unfortunately, we get through our podcast much too quick here. We're about out of time. But before we close out today, Greg, any final thoughts or suggestions for our community? I hope you'll come back pretty soon. We'd love to have you back on to get into this a little deeper. But why don't you leave us what your final words would be?
Sure. So first, Brian, thank you as a host for having me here today. Glad to be able to reach out to the audience and would love to come back at some point in the future. The way, if I could leave you with anything for you and the listeners right now, I would just share with everyone, please don't just make a purchase or provide a tool to your customers where you can't have a conversation. This is very much a challenge that we face that's a people and process problem right now. If we actually have regular communication, if you build that into your relationship, that solves the vast majority of like these worst case scenarios that we've talked about. That is critical to this. And if the customer is not willing to do it or the customer doesn't want to listen, I guess that's on them. But as long as we provide sufficient knowledge to them that we have to have a conversation regularly to protect your environment, then I think we've already had a big win right there.
Yeah, that's great. Conversation is key.
Yeah.
But so is execution. We know that too.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, a big thank you to Greg Rosenberg from Sophos for joining us today. I encourage those of you listening to today's Secure Connections podcast to check out our extensive library of past episodes. You can listen to the IOTA website at iota.com, or you can go to Google Play, Spotify, and other popular listening forums. Thanks again for joining us, and have a safe and secure day.